Well, what I want to do tonight is sort of got to thinking. I'm partly super excited because we get to study things that actually have a timeline in them. In Revelation, you have these seven seals, these seven trumpets, and you don't really know the timeline. It's like, is it happening one thing after another, or is it sort of some scholars think it's called a recapitulation, like it's sort of a circular event, like the same thing's happening, just described differently. I tend to think of them as linear. It's happening in sequence, chronologically, but you just don't know sometimes. And so here we get to this chapter about these two witnesses, this 1,260 days, these 3.5 years, these 42 months, and you go, all right, cool, we have something we can sink our teeth into and study with some specific numbers. Things that just don't make sense if they're symbolic. So I've been struggling here the last couple of weeks. It's like, I know that there are symbolic things. There are obvious symbolic things. Some things just don't sound symbolic. If it is symbolic, it's like trying to trick me to get me to understand it. And one of those is what I want to look at tonight, because I want to revisit a couple of things I thought about since last week about this whole thing. I didn't even think about it last week. I was so into studying the symbolism and trying to make sure I taught what it means, rather than what it really is. And last week, as I studied, I have one of my favorite commentaries is a guy named Tom Schreiner. His commentary on Revelation is about almost 800 pages long, and he's a professor at Southern Seminary. He's a friend of Megan's dad. Megan's dad is an elder at the church where they go, and Tom Schreiner is also an elder at the same church, so they know each other. And so I was talking to Megan's dad. His name's Peter, and I said, well, tell Tom Schreiner that everybody down here is going to believe what he believes about Revelation when they're done, because that's the commentary I've been using the most, actually. But there are several good ones. I like this guy named George Eldon Ladd. I like his commentary. And this week, I was like, I didn't even read John MacArthur. He's my hero. He's my favorite. Why don't I read his last week? So I read him this week, and I'm like going, oh, wow, I didn't even think about things like this. I at least want to go back and look at it. Now, I don't know if I have the right answer or the best answer, but I at least need to go look at it. And it's this. In chapter 11, verse 1, it said, John is told to go and measure the temple. And I was so wrapped up in, what does the temple mean? The temple means the people of God, or the place where God's people worship. And I started thinking of it more symbolic than what it really is. I believe it's literally, and I've even said this, I believe it's supposed to be a literal temple. There's something significant about the temple in the days that right before Jesus comes back. A temple. We looked at this last week, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. It says, the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. So this Antichrist is going to show up with, and we already know he's going to take over the whole world. And the one thing he's going to do is set himself up in the temple as God. He's going to oppose everything that's God, and he make himself to be the object of worship, the supreme object of worship for the whole world. So I think this is a literal temple building and not just some symbolic term for the saints. Some of the commentators want to make everything so symbolic. I'm like, I don't even know what it means anymore. Why is the word temple there? I don't know. It's like God's trying to trick me or something. So I'm just confessing that I'm a little frustrated by interpretations. But I think it's a literal temple, even though I admit that I'm not exactly sure what all of it means. But then when I say, okay, a literal temple, then you go, what temple? What temple am I talking about? The one that the Antichrist takes over, the one that he sets himself up to be worshiped by everybody in God's temple. That's what it says, right? sets himself up in God's temple. What about that one? What temple am I talking about? Well, I do know this. There is no temple in Israel right now. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD and has never been rebuilt since then. Now, Solomon built the first temple. God wouldn't let David do it, but Solomon did it. Well, that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians when they came and took over Israel. It was destroyed. And then when the Israelites came back from the Babylonian captivity they were, this fellow named Zerubbabel built the second temple. And I'm a little vague on how that one diminished and went away. But then Herod, who was around during Jesus' time, not the same Herod that was there for his trial, but the Herod who was, I think, his dad, he built the temple that stood in Jesus' day. It took us 40 years to build this temple, and you're going to build it back in 3 days, that whole scene, that temple. That's the third temple that's been built, and then that was the one that was destroyed by the Romans. And then you have this temple that the Antichrist is going to take over. There is no temple. What are we talking about, the temple? The temple that the Antichrist takes over has to be built sometime between now and the day when he takes it over, right? So there's no temple there now. I don't know what's going to happen. Right now there's one of the top 2 Muslim mosques on that place. The Dome of the Rock, it's called. It's built right where the temple was built. The temple was in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed it. It's on that place. So how is Israel going to build a temple on that place between now and when the Antichrist takes over? I don't know. I just know it's going to be there, and John is told to go measure that temple. I think that's the temple we're talking about. So somewhere between now and then, which is going to be halfway through the tribulation when the Antichrist takes over, which is what we started looking at last time. We did start looking at this. I do believe, according to the book of Daniel, Daniel has 77s. 69 of those 7s happen, and then Jesus comes and dies on the cross and is cut off. I don't know what the space in between the 69th 7 and the 70th 7 are, but this 70th 7, I believe, is the tribulation that's talking about in Revelation. That's a 7-year period of time that happens, is what the book of Tribulation is talking about, the time where God's judging the world. That's what we're looking at. And we also have been looking at this where it says in chapter 11, verse 2, it says, the Gentiles will trample the holy city for 42 months. So the Gentiles are going to come and take Jerusalem for 3.5 years. That's what 42 months are. That temple will be taken over by the Antichrist, and the Gentiles are going to come along with him. All the nations that he represents, all the nations that he rules, that he's in control of, are going to come and ransack Jerusalem and take it over. That's what I believe is going to happen. That's the 7-year tribulation, and that's the last half of the tribulation when that starts. I believe that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, where he sets himself up in God's temple, starts at this time right here. They'll trample on the holy city for 42 months. In the middle of that tribulation period of that 7 years is when the Antichrist comes and takes over. And it's going to be bad. The Gentiles will trample the holy city. They're going to tear up everything. I believe it's the same thing Jesus spoke about in Luke 21. It's the same thing as the prophet Zechariah wrote about in Zechariah 14. Luke 21:24 says, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled, which I believe is talking about the same exact thing as Revelation chapter 11. The Gentiles will come and ransack the city, take over the city for 42 months, 1,260 days, all those things. Zechariah 14 verse 2 says, God speaking through the prophet says, I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. So that sounds pretty much like the Gentiles to me. All the nations are going to come. They won't probably bring all their whole army, but they're going to bring at least a division from each army. A lot of warriors are going to come down, and they're going to trample Jerusalem to fight it. The city will be captured, the houses ransacked, and the women raped. Half of the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. That's going to happen. That's going to happen. It's right here in Revelation chapter 11, verse 2. Verse 3. Actually, verse 2. The Gentiles are going to take the city for 1,260 days. 42 months. They'll trample the holy city for 42 months. Verse 3 talks about the 1,260 days. So these pagan Gentiles are going to come to Jerusalem and trample it, take it over, ransack it, rape its women. It's going to be messy. It's going to be messy. Jerusalem will be a messy place to live when this happens. But then you get to verse 3, which is what we started to look at last time, and got a little ways in it, and then they go, I'm not even going to finish it this time because it's got a lot of meat in there. I'm not even sure what it all means, but verse 3 says, I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So we have these 2 witnesses that are going to show up in the middle of the tribulation, halfway into the tribulation, and they're going to prophesy for the rest of the tribulation, the last 3.5 years, the last 42 months, the last 1,260 days. These 2 witnesses are going to be prophets. They're going to witness. And I know it's 1,260 days, 42 months. We looked at this last time, Revelation 13:5. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise his authority for 42 months. So the last half of the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to be in control, and the Gentiles, all the nations are going to come and take over Jerusalem and mess it up. And you're going to have these 2 witnesses that show up preaching, prophesying, witnessing for those 3.5 years. And I believe this is exactly the same thing that we looked at last time too. Just some of this is review in the book of Daniel. I already said some of it. Daniel gives 77s. 69th 7 was when Jesus was cut off and crucified. And then we have the 70th 7 later at the end of the age when the tribulation starts. And it says in verse 24 through 27 of Daniel 9, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. So here's this ruler who's going to come with the nations, with the Gentiles, and destroy the city. War, desolation, the end will come like a flood. It's going to be a messy, messy scene in Jerusalem. And it says he, this ruler, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. So 1/7 means 7 years. So for 7 years, he's going to make a deal with people. He's going to make a deal, a covenant. He's going to make an agreement, a political agreement. He's going to be very savvy. He's going to be very, he's going to be intriguing. He's going to be a brilliant politician. This Antichrist will be brilliant. He'll get everybody on his side. They will agree with him. This is going to be peace. This is going to be great. I think this is the beginning of the tribulation, that he's going to make a covenant, confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. That's the tribulation period. That's what he's talking about. And in the middle of the 7, 3.5 years, he'll put an end to sacrifice and offering. This is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. This is the ruler who comes. And he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So this Antichrist is going to come up and set himself up as king, set himself up as Lord, as God. until it's over, until the end. Now, I believe this 7 that we're talking about here in Daniel chapter 9, this is what I really believe. I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to go with it. I might change my mind before I die someday. I don't know. But for now, this is where I'm going with this. This 7, he'll make a covenant with many for 1/7, is the 7-year Great Tribulation. We've already seen a lot of judgment in the first 3.5 years. The 7 trumpets and the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets have already happened, or at least 6 of those 7 trumpets have already happened in the first 3.5 years, and it's been bad. You already have half the population of the earth has been killed. And he hasn't even taken over yet to make himself God. But you have demons killing people. You have demons torturing people. You have all the ships, half of the ships, or a third of the ships being destroyed, a third of the sea life being destroyed, a third of the grass being burned up. All kinds of terrible things have already happened on the earth in the first 3.5 years. And now we're starting the second 3.5 years. This is happening. So I think these numbers are the exact same thing in Revelation 11 as are in Daniel chapter 9. Same thing. They begin and end at the same time. Now there have been all kinds of explanations, and this is part, I think, what makes this frustrating and confusing to study, because so many people, good-meaning, good, scholarly, genius, Christian men, I would even go as far as to say, if these men who make up these explanations and interpretations aren't scholars, there's no such thing as a scholar. They truly are brilliant, genius people, but they come up with so many explanations as to what this means, as to all this stuff, that I think it confuses me even more. To me, it does. If you're a genius and you come up with an interpretation that makes no sense, I don't know what to believe anymore, because you're the genius. Anyway, I do think that what's going to happen at the last 42 months of the tribulation, the last 42 months until the end, this is when the end's going to happen, when the Antichrist is destroyed. He himself will be destroyed. His end will come at the end of this. But I think this basically means that he's going to persecute the church. He's going to persecute Christians. He's going to persecute everyone who worships God, Christian or not. But he'll definitely persecute Christians, because we believe in the true God and we're not backing down. I believe he's going to persecute Israel. He's going to persecute Jews. Anybody who has anything that says about God, he's going to persecute. He will persecute Muslims if they hang on to Allah, their God, whatever they want to call him. He's going to persecute them too. In fact, I think he's going to be a Muslim. That's my view. That's my own personal understanding. He's going to take over the world. He's going to take over the temple. He's going to make himself God. This man of lawlessness will run the operation of persecuting Christians, persecuting believers in Jesus, persecuting anybody who claims they're God's people. He's going to go after them. So we have to study this man, the Antichrist. We're not going to get to him tonight because we got more of him to study in weeks to come, in chapters to come in the book of Revelation. He's in there a lot. But tonight I wanted to look at, who are these 2 witnesses? Because they're in there. 2 witnesses that prophesy for 42 months. 2 witnesses who prophesy for 1,260 days. And they're powerful. Who are they? Who are these 2 witnesses? Apparently they're 2 men, but I don't know who they are. And of course, then you got some commentators that don't want anything to be literal. They want everything to be symbolic and figurative. They suggest that these 2 witnesses are symbolic of the church witnessing to Israel. And all kinds of other things, but just they're symbolic. They're not real witnesses or real individual prophets or real individual people preaching, but just symbolic of the church. They're part of convincing Israel to turn to Jesus as their Savior. Now, it does say in Romans 11, all Israel will be saved. When the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, all Israel will be saved. So something's got to happen so that all the Gentiles who are going to believe finally believe, and then God's going to save Israel, the Jews. So this might be what that is. These two witnesses are highlighting the preaching of the gospel to the Jews while the Gentiles are ransacking Jerusalem and the Gentiles are taking over the world, and all the Gentiles, finally the last Gentile gets saved, and then Israel's going to get saved. Something like that. I think that's what's going on here. I really do think that. But I just don't know. I'm not willing to be dogmatic. But they are going to be convinced that Jesus is the Messiah because Paul says that in Romans 11. I don't think that's a bad idea. I don't think that's the wrong idea. These two witnesses, part of their ministry is preaching the gospel to whoever's listening. And they are in Jerusalem. My two witnesses are in Jerusalem when this is happening. There's going to be Jews everywhere when this is happening. This is what's happening at the end of the tribulation, the last 3.5 years. These two guys are preaching. I will say I do think too much symbolism about their identity confuses it even more. I don't have a problem that there are symbolic things in the book of Revelation or any prophetic language in Scripture, but making everything symbolic, everything just being a symbol of something, that just confuses me to no end. It really makes me want to go, I just don't want to preach this anymore or teach this. I don't get it. But if these two witnesses are two real, genuine men who preach the gospel, who are out there preaching, I don't know if I have a problem with that. It makes sense to me. And I really do wish I knew who they were, but I do get a clue right here in this text as to who they were. It says they're wearing sackcloth, which means two things. One is sackcloth was what you wore when you were mourning. It's what you wore when you were grieving. When something really stressed you out and you were just about to lose your mind with grief and sorrow, you would put on sackcloth and you would cry and mourn. But it was also the typical garment for a prophet. Would wear clothes that were like super humble and nasty. Their clothes give them away as a prophet. And I think their clothes also give them away as legitimately mourning. These two witnesses are preaching the gospel, but they're also mourning, wearing sackcloth in mourning, because much of the message that they preach in Jerusalem and everywhere else they preach, who knows where they go, but they're preaching for 3.5 years, and their message is judgment. Judgment on the world, judgment on Israel, judgment to whoever does not believe. So they are themselves having a hard time, but they are prophets, and they are wearing sackcloth, which is the garb of prophets. 2 Kings 1:8 says, they replied, he was a man with a garment of hair. So he wore a shirt or a tunic or some kind of clothing made out of hair, camel hair, weaved together, so that's what he wore, like sackcloth. And he had a leather belt around his waist, and the king said, this was Elijah the Tishbite. That's what Elijah wore. Same thing John the Baptist wore. Camel hair. Probably not very appealing, nasty. Anyway, these are two special prophets, not just ordinary guys that like to preach, but something special about these two. Because it says it in verse 4, these are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. Now you get to things where you go, you know it's symbolic. Olive trees, lampstands. We're not talking about two literal olive trees and two literal lampstands. Those things have to be symbolic. What's he talking about there? Well, I believe this is a reference to an allusion in the prophecies of Zechariah in the Old Testament, because the book of Zechariah is mostly a prophetic book about end times, about the millennium. That's what's happening in the book of Zechariah. And this is an allusion to that, because Zechariah talks about this very same thing in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. He asked me, "What do you see?" I answered, "I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lights on it, with 7 channels to the lights. Also, there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left." There's 2 olive trees that Zechariah is talking about, and 2 olive trees that John's writing about in Revelation 11, the 2 witnesses. These are the 2 olive trees. Back in Zechariah 4 again, verse 11, then I asked the angel, "What are these 2 olive trees on the right and on the left of the lampstand?" Again I asked him, "What are these 2 olive branches beside the 2 gold pipes that pour out golden oil?" And he replied, "Do you not know what these are?" "No, my Lord," I said. So he said, "These are the 2 who are anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth." It sounds very much like Revelation chapter 11, verse 4, where he says, "These are the 2 olive trees and 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth." Like the same language in Revelation is in the Old Testament book of Zechariah. These are the 2 who are anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth. Almost the exact same language. So I start to wonder, not trying to be hyper with my symbolism, but if these 2 aren't what Zechariah's prophesying about in Zechariah chapter 4, are not the same 2 people, the same 2 witnesses that John sees in Revelation 11, the same 2 guys. I wonder if they're not the same. Zechariah identifies them as a fellow named Joshua, who's the high priest. He was the high priest during the time when Israel was rebuilding the temple after the Babylonian captivity. Joshua was the high priest. Not when they were building the wall, rebuilding the city, but rebuilding the temple. Joshua was the high priest. And then also this guy named Zerubbabel, who was the governor in Israel while the temple was being built. That's who Zechariah is referring to, Joshua and Zerubbabel. Don't you know who these 2 are? These are the 2 lampstands. These are the 2 anointed ones to serve the Lord. It's Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor. At this point, it's likely something that happens very similar with, or same 2 guys, or the same type of guys, same type of people that are the 2 witnesses. Does anybody know? Do y'all have any idea? I'm just going on in my mind, but I'm going on when I was reading, with a lot of help, I think, from John MacArthur. Not just him, but a bunch of guys. But same kind of language. Something like this happens with the 2 witnesses. Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan at his right hand to accuse him." So Joshua the high priest is standing before the Lord, standing before the angel of the Lord. Satan is there accusing him. Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, he said to me, "This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel." This is like one of the classic texts of the Old Testament. "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord Almighty. What are you, O mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you will become level ground. Then he will bring out the capstone to shouts of God bless it, God bless it." So I'm still at this place where I'm not sure I know exactly who these 2 witnesses are in chapter 11, but it seems like a very reasonable answer to me that there's some type of equivalent to these 2 Old Testament saints, Joshua, the high priest, and Zerubbabel, the governor. That makes sense to me. That's what I'm thinking. Just going to go ahead and say it. I think that's a reasonable answer. These two men, Joshua and Zerubbabel, try to say that 4 times real fast, were anointed and authorized by God to the people of Israel. Now, this is where it starts to get goofy, I think, a little bit, because how many of y'all heard this before? The 2 witnesses, they must be Moses and Elijah. Anyone ever heard that? That's a classic common answer of who these 2 witnesses are. This is the prophet Moses and the prophet Elijah. Very common answers. They represent God's prophetic order, and Moses represents the law. They represent the prophetic order and the prophetic community in Israel. Also, they're also called Moses and Elijah because of the unique ways that they are able to judge and cause the adversaries to be destroyed. Fire, plagues, drought, same things that happened with Moses and Elijah in the Old Testament. Fire, plagues, drought, same thing. So Moses and Elijah are called these 2 witnesses many times. Moses and Elijah also are the 2 guys that appeared before Jesus when he was transfigured. You know this one back in Matthew 17? He took Peter and James and John with him up on the mountain, and while he was up there, he transformed before them. Matthew 17, 2 and 3. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Just then there appeared before him Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Because Moses and Elijah appeared with Jesus on the mountain of transfiguration when he was transfigured before Peter, James, and John, scholars think that these 2 witnesses are Moses and Elijah. I don't know. Some have claimed that they're Enoch and Elijah. Enoch was the 7th from Adam, and the reason why they say this must be Enoch and Elijah is because Enoch and Elijah didn't die. And it says in the Bible, it's appointed for man once to die. Here's 2 guys that have never died. They were just taken up. Remember Enoch, he just walked with God, and then he was no more. God just took him. Elijah was on a chariot when a chariot of fire and horses came and took him up. Just raptured him right on up. So Elijah never died. So some people think that this is Enoch and Elijah because of the way they didn't die. I honestly don't know, but I do think this. Whenever someone uses this kind of explanations with me, Moses, Elijah, Enoch, Elijah, it starts to get goofy. It starts to get like, why would you come up with some crazy interpretation like that? There's nothing in the text that would lead you to that. There's nothing in the text of Revelation 11 that would lead you to think that's Moses and Elijah. Nothing in the text that would lead you to think that must be Enoch and Elijah. There is stuff in the text that would say, these are the 2 olive trees of Zechariah. That's in the text. And the allusion is obvious. But there's no allusion to Moses and Elijah, no allusion to Enoch and Elijah. It's stuff like that. It just confuses me even more. It makes it more difficult to interpret. Because now you got to weed through interpretations that are very popular in culture, in Christian culture, but you have no real reason ever to go back and believe that. It's clever and it's neat, and it would be so cool if it's true. I just don't know how true it is. Just want to say that. I do know this. These 2 witnesses, whoever they are, Joshua type character, Zerubbabel type character, Moses type character, Enoch type character, Elijah type character, I don't know. But whoever they are, I do know this about them. They are Christians. They do believe in Jesus. These are not just Old Testament style prophets. These are New Testament prophets. These are prophets who believe that Jesus died on the cross for them and they've trusted him. It says in verse 8 of this chapter, which we won't get there tonight because we're out of time now. Their bodies, after they're killed, their bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. So these two prophets believe in Jesus Christ, their Lord, and they die in the same city where he was crucified. So these are Christian prophets. These two guys, these two prophets are Christians. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to have to pick up this one next time. I got through verse 14 to get through chapter 11, so we've got plenty more material about these two witnesses. So that's a good place to stop. I just want to say this real quick. These two prophets have superpowers. Like it's not just two guys that are preaching in the streets or two guys that are yelling out on the street corner or finding a place where there's a pulpit and preaching from. They're prophesying and they have superpowers. And we'll look at that next time in verse 5 and following. So pray with me. Father God, I do thank you for giving us this time tonight to study your word. And I do ask you that you will help us understand what it means. This very mysterious, difficult to interpret book about the end of the world, about the end of the age, of the end of the time. Some of it seems simple and easy. 3.5 years and 42 months, 1,260 days, and the two witnesses prophesying. I do pray you'll help us, Father, understand more and believe and enjoy it as we study it. Do this for us, I pray, tonight and every day. Father, bless us as we go home. Keep us safe this week. Protect us. Show us favor. Use us, Lord, to glorify Jesus. Use us to speak of him. Use us to tell of his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. Use us to share of him to the lost, and they may believe and be saved. Bring us together again Sunday, where we can be together, the whole church, all of us here at South Strand, to worship, fellowship, and study your word. So Jesus will be glorified in us even more. I ask these things in his name. Amen.